In this exercise, we're going to take a look at using IMVU Studio's particle system to make a simple particle accessory effect. So of course, before we start, we need to make sure that we have a diffuse that can be an actual shape. So we've got a little heart shape here, or just a flat color, because if we're using particles, we want to make sure that we are going to be using an opacity map or an alpha mask. So an opacity map, so we have gradients of grey, white, black, black being transparent, white, grey being opaque or transparent to varying degrees, and our mask that defines the shape, and then a normal map which can be useful depending on the effect that we're going to generate. So those are our four images. So we've got our heart, the diffuse which we see, the opacity mask, so this is our variable transparency. We have a hard mask which will be for alpha clip or alpha test in Studio, and then we have our normal map. So in Studio we want to create our project, so click the create button and then just derive from the empty accessory, so female or male, so we'll choose female because that's open. Derive. That will give us our avatar based on our settings. So to create the particle system, we want to be in particle component. Click on the plus button and that will create an instance. We can have multiple instances and each one will have its properties. Emission, that essentially defines the appearance of the particles. Origin, that defines where they appear, where they spawn into the world. Direction is obviously the direction of travel that the particles take. And then gravity is whether the world influences the particles and their behavior after they have been spawned. So using these defaults, we can enable all of this by clicking on preview to see what this does. This will give us an initial particle effect. So what we can also do, just to assist the process, view, we want particles, and this will give us a little helper, a graphical helper, that helps us identify and define our particle system. So this shape is where the particles appear, so this is their origin. Right now the direction is indicated by this red handle within the widget, and then the gravity that's also indicated by this widget. So right now it's y1 and y minus 1, so y1 is backwards from the avatar and minus 1 is negatively backwards from the avatar. So for example, if we just change minus 1 to 1, preview, this will change the behavior of the particles so they are affected upwards by gravity. We can also then change the orientation. So we'll change Z to 1, Y to 0, so they're going to go up the Z-axis, which is the blue handle of the widget. Preview. And that gives us a stream of particles that are affected positively by gravity. If we wanted an upward direction but a negative influence, what we would do, set Z as is and then change the gravity to a negative number, and that will give us this effect. So if we want to change the behavior of the particles, we edit gravity. If we want to change the basic direction, we edit direction. If we want to change the origin, we edit the origin settings. Let's change this back to a positive number just to make this easier to see. So if you want to reduce the size of the origin point, the point from which they spawn, let's say width of the avatar, we want to change the end radius. So let's try 0.35. That narrows the origin so that the particles now spawn within this much smaller area. So we've used origin, that sets the area, direction, that sets the orientation, and gravity, that sets the behavior. So to change the particles themselves, we're in Emission. So we can increase the number or decrease by changing the rate. So if we make this 100, this will spawn a huge amount of particles. But it'll do so in clumps because the speed is too high for the particle system to generate particles. So if we use a lower number, let's say 2, we'll get a constant stream of particles, but at a much lower rate. So let's go back to 10. Lifetime, that defines essentially how long the particles last. So if we have one of these set to 1 and the other set to 5, the particles don't last as long, and they randomly, some will appear live for longer. So the particles will be alive for between 1 and 5 seconds, so randomly between those two values. We can change the speed, minimum, maximum, so the higher the values, the higher the speed. For some of them, but not others, again, it'll randomly slow some down, speed some up. So let's go really slow. 0.01, 0.75. That slows them right down. We'll take a look at rotation once we've got the particle in place, the image, because that makes it easier to see how this affects the particle system. And then size, we can change these to change the size randomly of the particles. So again, in combination, we're essentially changing the behavior, the appearance of our particles. So let's just rename this. Hearts. Make sure the node is set to attachment root. Just preview. And then what we're going to do is save this project before we start editing the material. So, hamburger icon, file, save as, hearts, PRT, save. So to adjust the actual appearance of the particle itself in terms of what we're looking at, we want to be in material component. And here we'll find a material instance that corresponds to our particle. And as with all materials for all types of projects, it works the same way, it functions the same way. So we can change the name. This makes it easy to identify if we have multiple particles, because each particle system will have a material instance available to us to edit. Let's just save this, and then what we're going to do, load in our diffuse. So as with all materials, mouse over the icon, get the plus sign, click, that opens the texture pop-up, click add image, and then browse to your image. So there is our image, that's our diffuse, open. Opacity, same again, click the icon, click add image, and here we can use a mask, a black and white mask, or grayscale, depending on the effect that we're after. Because we're going to use some effects, we're going to set up emission, we want to use the mask because transparency washes out when emission is active. So mask, open, and then preview so that we can see the basic effect. So that's our basic particle. Let's save this, save, and then what we can do, same again for shininess and emission again, but shininess, depending on the strength of the effect that we're going to use, may be washed out using this effect. So we'll add it nonetheless, plus add image, select our grayscale, open, preview. This will affect the shininess, but again may not be visible depending on the effect. Emission, because we've already loaded in the image that we want, we can select it from the texture editor or the texture panel. So select, preview, and then what we do in our settings is enable emission. Enable emission, turn that down a little bit, preview, and there are our lava glow hearts. Let's turn that down a bit more. Even more. And remember that the effect, the strength of the effect, differs depending on the brightness of the room that you're in. So always keep that in mind when setting the emission setting. Let's save this. And if we wanted to add any other effects, we could do that. So let's add self-illuminate, which emission kind of does by default. And that's our basic texture. So that's the material component. But now that we have that in place, what we can do is go back to particle component. Now that we can see how our particles are being spawned and how they behave, what we can do here is set rotation. If we zero this out for both max and min, and preview, we have our hearts spawning in a fixed orientation. Let's see how high up that goes. So the settings that we've got set have that going all the way up to the top. So if we want to adjust that, change lifetime. So let's go with a small value, so 0.25 and 1. Preview. That has our hearts at the ground, so we can adjust this until we get 2.5. Let's try 1.75. Not quite. Let's go with 2. There we go. That is our particle effect. So, just to summarize, we've created the particle, we're in particle component, created the particle, we've renamed it, and we've set the node. The emission sets the behavior or the appearance of the particles. Origin sets where it spawns from. Direction sets the direction of travel. And then gravity sets the influence the environment might have, gravity, on the effects after they're spawned. In material component, we've obviously set up our material to function the way that any other material would do for any other product type. In this case, we've set the emission. So, once we've got all of these basics in place, so we have a particle stream, we have it set to emit from a relatively small area, and it's emitting or travelling in a straight line upwards. Once we've got all of that, if we wanted to change the location of the particle system, what we would have to do is go into skeleton component. There is our skeleton instance, and on the right we set the node. At the moment it's female O3 master root, which is the bone at the bottom of the avatar. So if we set this to pelvis node, preview, it changes the location of the spawn point the particles emit from. And we can set that to anything that we want. But there's a big caveat. Let's change this to spine 04, which is about where the heart actually is. So preview. We need to be mindful of the behavior of the particles, because the orientation of the bone, the actual bone itself, differs depending on where it is. So this changes the axis of orientation. So we can see the green handle, the end handles pointing up now, and the blue handle is pointing outwards. So if you compare that to female O3 master root, that differs because the blue handle points up, the green handle points backwards, and the red handle out to the side. So this is changing the orientation of the particle emission. So that means that if we want to change the bone the particle is emitting from, we have to accommodate this changing axis for the particle. So we've got, so back in particle component, we've got this particle being emitted on the z-axis, which is the blue handle, in a positive direction, but gravity is influencing that in a positive direction relative to the y-axis, which is the red handle. So we should be able to change y to 1, z to 0, and that should have the particles emitting on the z-axis. But it doesn't, so we can try changing that to the x-axis. And that fixes the problem. So that's one thing that we do have to be mindful of when we are changing the bone from which the particle emits. The orientation, the normal, doesn't always make obvious sense relative to what we're looking at. So let's save this as a different file. File, save as PRT2. And then all we need to do, info, add our icon, or choose a thumbnail. We'll set that, change the settings, profit, keywords, any other settings, and then submit to the catalogue. That's the basics of particles in Studio.